The next presenter is Professor Reid, who will talk to us about Cardiovascular Registry trial. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dorota. And firstly, thanks for the invitation to be part of this webinar. It's my first go of the webinar, so I hope it goes okay. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which everybody's meeting, and we're covering the entire country today, I suspect, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to those who may be attending this meeting. I'm going to talk a little bit over the next 15 to 20 minutes about the potential. I think we've all recognised the value and the potential of registry-based randomised trials, and I think there has certainly been a lot of enthusiasm about moving rapidly towards this for a variety of reasons, which I'll point out. But I have a little bit of hesitation in some aspects, because I think there still needs to be quite a bit of work done in really ensuring ourselves that what we're collecting and what we're reporting and what we're producing from randomised registry-based trials is really high quality, gold standard research, because that is what I think we're aiming for. So what I'd like to do, just by moving these slides forward, is talk a little bit about where we are with cardiovascular disease registries in Australia, and I must say it's been a long journey in this space over many years. I'd like to talk about a little bit about the cardiovascular registry-based randomised controlled trials, and there's been some terrific work being done overseas, particularly in Scandinavia, where a very large proportion of their investment has gone into clinical quality registries in the health sector. And I think what we're now seeing is really a return on the investment in clinical quality registries, with the opportunity and demonstration of how they not only can provide valuable information on the quality of care and outcomes and benchmarking performance, but they can also be an incredible platform to answer questions. And I think we're seeing more of that. We're seeing an appetite for that, not only in Scandinavia, but really all over the world, and also here in Australia. I want to pose the question: shouldn't we just accept the registry data? If we're collecting data, shouldn't we just use it? Do we really need to be overly concerned about the outcomes that we're reporting in our randomised registry trials? What are some of the problems there? And also just touch a little bit on, well, what are our next steps? Where do we see ourselves going, certainly in the cardiovascular space, over the next few years? Well, it's scary to think how long we've been actually working in the cardiovascular registry space in Australia. We started originally with the ANZCATS, the Australian New Zealand Society for Cardiothoracic Surgery, with a demonstration project done in 6 hospital sites in Victoria, and this was almost over 20 years ago now. And it's interesting that the issues that were there 20 years ago still are important today. And one of them was around the quality of data that we're collecting and reporting on this information. It was spurned from the inquiry in the UK around adverse outcomes or poor performance in a particular paediatric cardiac surgery hospital, and that had an appetite, or it really got people thinking about how important it is to collect this information. And when we started looking around, it was quite interesting. In Victoria at that time, 6 hospitals were actively collecting their information, but they were doing it really independently. And when we just simply tried to pull those data together and report on hospital performance, we saw this really concerning sign. And this was in the outcome here, I hope you can see, was readmission to surgery for bleeding. And that bleeding, that's actually one of the key sort of cardiovascular outcomes that that is important to report on as an endpoint for a trial, for example. And what we saw was a very big difference across the hospitals. And the initial thought was, oh gosh, hospital D here has got a terrible bleeding rate. But the reality was we weren't reporting on the same types of outcome measures. They were classifying their cases quite differently to all of the other hospitals. And so right at a very first step in the registry process, the importance of data quality in reporting on clinical outcomes was really front and centre. And I think it's been part of our thinking all the way through. But we have come a long way certainly in the surgical space and in the interventional cardiology space. We've done a lot of work with the Australian Commission for Safety and Quality in Health on the development of Australian clinical quality registers. And one of the key operating principles is an agreement around a very standard set of data definitions for both information in all aspects of the registry data that's being collected. And the concept within the clinical quality registries really is that it only represents potentially a spine, and that there's really minimal core data that's collected. It does need to be very objectively collected, so that we shouldn't be relying totally on specialist knowledge to collect this data. It should be objectively collected. The outcomes need to be very relevant, and of course, if we're talking about using these registries as a basis for trials, then of course those outcomes need to focus on key relevant outcomes related to either the intervention or the treatment or the focus of interest in the trial. Registries rely very much on the concept of all or none, no cherry picking, everybody's in. And so I think it's been terrific what we've seen in Australia about the movement towards opt-out consent for clinical quality registries. And that's also, I think, having a real impact on the potential for the registries to be the framework for undertaking randomised controlled trials. And I think there's been such a change over the last, even 5 years or so, with the loosening up of data in its current or in its previous silos, and allowing researchers with good governance to have access to longer term administrative data, which can also be incorporated in clinical outcomes for registry-based randomised trials. So our registries, having been structured, really are growing really exceptionally well in Australia. We're now, certainly with the ANZCETS database, we've topped around 160,000 cases in that database. We've almost plateaued out in terms of the engagement with cardiac surgical sites around Australia, with virtually about 90% of all Australian sites participating. This includes both public and private hospital sectors. And I think that is a real and important framework on which we can base the opportunity to ask really important clinical trial questions, knowing that we've got very wide coverage. Virtually all cardiac surgery in the country is participating in a registry, and now we're actually having New Zealand join as well. So the structures are coming very nicely in place for this to be able to be achieved on. But it hasn't just been cardiac surgery. There's been also an enormous amount of work being put in the area of interventional cardiology. And when you think about cardiovascular procedures and cardiovascular activity, these are often what's considered in the bracket of high cost, high risk, high value procedures. They're just the sort of procedures that we really need to have very clear evidence of what works, evidence of what treatments are most effective, And that itself, that evidence, utilising registries to generate that evidence through registry-based trials is a clear opportunity for us in this country. And there have been efforts driven by government, driven by societies, and at this stage, the Commission, the Commonwealth Government, are also getting actively involved, developing the next phase of this activity, which is the National Cardiac Registry. I'm very pleased to say Western Australia now also, and New South Wales are now also participating in developing these registries. So we're going to have complete national coverage across the country, which is a terrific development. From the research perspective, it's very clear that initially it's been primarily on observational outcome studies, and this is in the process of changing now that the structures are in place. But some of the key concepts around being sure that the registries are the framework on which we can rely on results from trials also involves validation and validation studies, and we have been doing a little bit of this over the last few years. One of the concepts around the movement from administrative and registry data, which gives us good quality data on benchmarking and driving quality improvement, and with the utility to simply add that specific specific trial data, either in even as much as a single bit of additional information specific to a trial, because our registries are very much based on the concept of the minimal data spine. So when we add a specific trial-related information, we add a step of randomization, and we then end up with very cost-effective clinical trials. And certainly this has been something that was highlighted a number of years ago now, and probably one of the most widely cited randomized registry trial was the TASTE trial. And the TASTE trial was done on the back of the Swedish, the Swedeheart registry, which was one of the major Scandinavian registries, which demonstrated that the ability to undertake or to randomise, in this case, nowhere near as many as Andrew's intensive care unit studies in the peptic study, but in the TASTE trial they were able to randomise just over 7,000 patients who are undergoing angiography and PCI. Importantly, this was actually 61% of all patients having a PCI procedure in the entire country, and it was 82% of all eligible patients, suggesting that there's really great generalizability, wide coverage, and rapid uptake of recruitment into the TASTE trial. Its design followed those key classic features of a good quality randomised trial, a multi-centre. This was open label, but it was randomised trial. It had online data collection through the National Registry Program. The monitoring and outcomes were collected as part of the registry activity. But very interesting, in the TASTE trial, there was no separate monitoring or adjudication of the endpoints. And the endpoints for the primary TASTE trial was 30-day mortality. And in the TASTE trial with their national registries, no patients were lost to follow-up. And I think what stunned most people around the world was that they were able to do this particular study at a very small incremental cost of $50 per patient. And that's almost unheard of when you consider the amount of investment that is put into conventional randomised trials. And it was certainly recognised that this methodology is really the next disruptive technology in clinical research. And I think we're actually starting to see even further disruptive technologies in clinical research and clinical trials with that utility to use not only registry data, but the potential then to look at registry data with administrative data for not only looking at short 30-day outcomes in this case, but the potential for long-term clinical outcomes in large multi-centred registry-based randomised trials. So when you look closely at the CBD endpoints in the TASTE trial, what was interesting was that they used both population health records, their population death records, and Sweden, having lived there for a couple of years, many years ago, Sweden's a terrific place in relation to the government, the cradle to grave concept. So everybody does have a utility or a social security number effectively. So the opportunity for record linkage and follow-up where you have a health identification number is ideal for this sort of research. So their primary outcome was all-cause mortality at 30 days, but they had the secondary outcomes were pretty conventional cardiovascular outcomes of 30-day rehospitalisation for recurrent myocardial infarction, stent thrombosis, or the requirement for a repeat PCI either in the target vessel or the target lesion. They had a composite of all cause and recurrent myocardial infarctions, but they also used complications resulting from the procedure, such as requirement for a further PCI, stroke, heart failure, and they used a length of hospital stay. The question always, and as you might recall, I mentioned that they actually didn't do any monitoring in the TASTE study. So the question always, in my mind, is how valid are these population-based endpoints and endpoints from the registries, knowing that we rely, in our registries, we rely very much on individual sites adhering to protocols, but we know that there's a degree of variation. Data managers change over time, things can vary. So what's the level of monitoring and validation and adjudication that we actually need in our registries to really give us confidence around the registry-based trial delivering to the standard of conventional randomised controlled trial? So the little bit of work that we've been doing over the years, and we probably haven't been doing enough of it, because I tend to think we really need to keep focusing on these areas. One is around the quality control activities in our cardiovascular registries, where we do have a regular auditing program. We have a continuous monitoring cycle of centres, but of course that costs money, and we can't do it weekly, monthly. We can basically do it on a yearly or an annual basis, and we can't do all of them every year. Not all sites every year. So we have a rotational scheme where we do audit sites, but it's probably not really enough to give us the level of confidence. Although when we do audit, we find very high levels of agreement in both the PCI registries and in the surgical registries on what we actually can see in the records within the hospitals as to what we're actually seeing in the registry. So those high levels of agreement give us some confidence that the information and many of those data points are in fact those key clinical outcome measures as I described for the TASTE trial. Certainly the hospital-based outcome measures, we have some level of confidence that registry-based data is of reasonable quality. We're also very interested in using our longitudinal outcomes and utilising opportunities such as the National Death Index and utilising opportunities such as hospital admissions and discharge databases. And I think that's something that we're going to see a lot more of. The previous talk was really a nice demonstration of how we can do that type of work. We've had a look at how well our 30-day mortality records reflect in our National Death Index, and look at around about 97% a direct match between our records in the registry and the national death index. But of course, that's on a probabilistic matching method, given that we don't have a unique patient identifier here in this country. But similarly, it's actually quite good when you look at what these sort of records are like internationally in the STS database from the USA. And the USA actually do have a social security number, an individual patient identifier. Their rates are around about 90%. So it's looking like the registry-based data and certainly the national index, national death index data might give us pretty reasonable or some comfort, at least, is that if we use those for our outcome measurements in trials, we might not be too far off the mark, but are we close enough? So I always tend to go to the Scandinavians when I'm trying to see what's actually happening in this space. And I'm sorry, that slide doesn't look out too well, but this is if we're looking at adjudicating endpoints in clinical trials, this is the conventional process. And it is for those of you who have done this, you'll know it's a painstaking process. It requires well-trained staff, certainly to collect specific site records, to put those into a format which can be either scanned or emailed or in the old days posted through to a central endpoint coordinating office, who would then check them for quality, and if there was anything missing, that would go back to the site and we'd ask for more information. Once we go through that again and at the office site we're happy, it then goes to a clinical event adjudication coordinator, who would then allocate it to one of our physician investigators or our physician adjudicators. Normally we'd have 2 adjudicators who do this. We would then normally, if we have concordance of adjudication, that would be a confirmed endpoint. If we don't have confirmed or a concordant adjudication, that would then go to either a 3rd adjudicator or to a committee. Now that process itself can take quite a lot of time. It's labour intensive, but it certainly gives you good quality data. But I guess the question is, in randomised registry trials, are we looking to move away from that type of detailed method, and can we, just like in the TASTE trial, simply rely on the information we're getting from the registries? Often a lot of the registry and the administrative data will rely on ICD codes, and the accuracy of clinical endpoint detection using registries only, and compared to this active process of screening and follow-up in clinical adjudication, is unknown, and it's under investigation. And this was I think towards the end of last year, when Klaus Held from Uppsala, who managed the SwedeHeart and the suite of Swedish cardiovascular registries. So they're certainly looking hard at how accurate that registry or reliance on the registry-based data is in comparison to the conventional approach. And I think also we're now moving into the space with electronic health records and registries, the potential to accelerate this methodology, potentially using artificial intelligence methods in the identification and adjudication of clinical endpoints, which can then provide us with, which can then be a substitute from this laborious, time-consuming and costly process. I think it is becoming close to being a reality in the future. And clearly, just like the randomised registry trials have reduced the cost of recruitment and the speed of recruitment, if we can be efficient at this end of the trial and the adjudication of outcomes, then I think we've got a very nice package in which we're able to ask key questions from cardiovascular outcomes registries and trials. Just a little comment on using ICD codes for long-term clinical outcomes in cardiovascular-based not only registry trials, but trials per se. This is some nice work from the 45 and up group in New South Wales, who looked at the challenges in utilising ICD codes for identifying particular clinical outcomes for cardiovascular events. And whilst the slide's not all that clear, you can see that the number of different codes that constitute a definition of a percutaneous coronary intervention or grafting, or whether an implant was required. There are numerous codes, and the combinations of these can provide very subtle differences in the type of events that are being recorded. Codes vary from hospitals, the procedures, and when the codes are done, they will often have actually primary codes, secondary codes, tertiary codes, and it's how those are grouped, which, and I think that was the key outcome from this paper, is how important that grouping of codes are to categorize events, to formulate an endpoint definition is absolutely critical. And if we're using this routinely collected data to provide endpoints for clinical trials, we need to have very clear explanations of those groupings. So finally, what are the next steps? Well, again, towards the end of last year, the Swedish put out some guidelines for registry-based randomised clinical trials. Really interesting paper. I recommend it to you. It's just a nice little summary of a framework for registry-based trials. But this is what they did say in the continuous adjudication of clinical events, and it is that there is adjudication. So even though the TASTE trial didn't go through an adjudication process, it does seem that the current thoughts around registry-based trials still involve some form of adjudication of clinical events. And I guess what I'm interested in people's thoughts and others' ideas is, what is the level of adjudication that would give us the confidence that what we're reporting from randomised registry trials and from routinely collected outcome data, what level of confidence do we actually need to ensure that they can inform on our decisions resulting from the conduct of randomised registry trials? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm very interested in others' comments or thoughts. So just in conclusion, I think there's still a little way to go before the complete reliance on endpoints or outcomes from registries are automatically assumed as being valid endpoints for registry-based trials. I'm not quite sure we're there yet. This distributed approach to collecting that information through utilising outcomes such as the National Death Index and hospital readmission data, the opportunity to use registry-specific data that's collected as part of routine clinical practice, and if we can be confident that that's of high quality and accuracy, then I think that would be great. And then, of course, we'd still need some trial-specific data to give us that sort of granular information that's often needed for endpoint confirmation in trials. The monitoring and validation methodology for endpoint adjudication in randomised registry trials is still being developed, and we're hoping to be able to contribute to some of that with our well-established registries at this point. The clinical event adjudication committee approach, perhaps it could be adopted on a subset of randomly selected events from registries. I think those evaluation studies will be really important, and then will help us guide the way. But I think total reliance on registry collected endpoint data could only be achieved in alignment with routine and reported quality monitoring of outcomes information. At the moment, our infrastructure, certainly for our cardiovascular registries, whilst we can do some, maybe we're not quite in the position to do it all. but it is rapidly evolving, and certainly watch this space, because I think we're going to see a lot more of it over the next few years. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation at the end of the meeting, and I'll hand over to Dorita to continue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris.